My name is Sergeant Callie Carr, 33 years old, and 3 days ago, I buried the only person on Earth who ever called me family. My grandfather, Colonel Winston Carr. But now I was facing my sister, Brenda. She slid a stack of papers across the desk toward me. Sign the transfer of Grandpa's assets, or I'll see you in court, you non-blood sister. Brenda's voice, sharp as shrapnel, echoed in the small office. When I remained silent, she smirked, a cruel, familiar twist of her lips. Don't play dumb. He may have been fond of you, but you were always the charity project he picked up. Blood is what matters. You have no claim here. Every word was a bullet, fired directly into a wound that hadn't even begun to heal. They thought my silence was fear. They were wrong. Before I tell my story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe if you've ever been made to feel like an outsider in the very home you gave your all to. This story is for you. The silence that followed her opening salvo was thick and suffocating. It hung in the stale air of the small rented law office Brenda had chosen for this ambush. The room smelled of cheap wood veneer and old paper, a stark contrast to the cloying scent of Brenda's expensive perfume. We were in Fayetteville, North Carolina, a military town. A town where the uniform I wore was meant to stand for something. But in this room, it was just another target. Brenda wasn't alone. She had brought her legal team, 2 men in slick, expensive suits, with vacant eyes and expressions molded from indifference. They hadn't offered condolences for the colonel. They hadn't even shaken my hand. They looked at me the way an exterminator looks at a problem that needs to be removed, efficiently and without emotion. The meeting had started with an act of theater. Brenda had strode in, her high heels clicking aggressively on the worn laminate floor, and dropped her Louis Vuitton handbag onto the table. It landed with a heavy, muffled thud, a sound that was both a declaration of her status and a dismissal of the solemnity of our purpose. She took a sip from a large paper cup, leaving a perfect, scarlet lipstick stain on the foam of her overpriced latte. Then, speaking to her lead attorney, but loud enough for the entire room to hear, she'd sighed dramatically. Let's get this done. I have a spa appointment at noon. It wasn't just a slight against me. It was a desecration of our grandfather's memory, reducing his life's legacy to an inconvenient line item on her social calendar. Now, her attack continued, her voice dripping with a lifetime of practiced condescension. Look at you, Callie, she sneered, gesturing toward me with a finger tipped with a blood-red, glossy nail. Still in that uniform, as if it gives you some kind of authority here. This is the real world, not your little army base. In the real world, money and blood are the law. I kept my back straight, my hands resting calmly on my knees. My posture was ingrained from years of training, a discipline that was now my shield. I didn't let my gaze waver from hers. Inside, a storm was raging. Each word was a calculated strike, designed to dismantle the identity the colonel had so carefully helped me build. The charity project, the outsider, the non-blood sister. These were the labels she had tried to brand me with since the day I arrived at their home as a scared, quiet child. He gave you a name, Brenda went on, her voice rising slightly as my silence began to unnerve her. He gave you a roof over your head. You should be grateful. Instead, you're sitting here, pretending you have a right to any of this. She pushed the stack of documents closer to me. The crisp scent of fresh ink and paper filled the space between us. Sign the papers. Take the small, merciful sum I'm offering you and get out of this family's life for good. My mind, however, wasn't on the pain. It was on my training. When faced with a psychological assault, the first step is to remain calm. Assess the threat, identify the objective, exploit the weakness. Grandpa's voice echoed in my memory, as clear as if he were standing behind me. Never let the enemy know what you're thinking, Sergeant. Let your actions do the talking. The threat was obvious, Brenda and her legal firepower. Her objective was equally clear, intimidate me into surrendering my claim to what she believed was solely her birthright, and her weakness. It was radiating off her in waves, her impatience evidenced by the spa appointment, her arrogance which led her to underestimate me. and her greed, so potent it was practically a third person in the room. This wasn't just a legal dispute. I realized it with cold clarity. It was a test, a final field exercise designed by the greatest strategist I had ever known. And I was not going to fail him. My silence stretched, filling the room with a pressure that made one of Brenda's lawyers shift uncomfortably in his chair. Brenda's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "Well, are you deaf?" I said, "Sign it." Finally, I moved. I didn't reach for the papers. I simply adjusted my position, my gaze steady. When I spoke, my voice was level, devoid of the emotion churning inside me. It was the voice I used to give a briefing, calm and precise. "I will review these documents," I stated, my tone leaving no room for argument. Brenda's eyes narrowed. "Review them? There's nothing to review. It's all standard." I ignored her, my focus now on her lead attorney. "We will meet again to discuss this." I was no longer a participant in her ambush. I was setting the terms of engagement. "When? Where?" he asked, caught off guard by the shift in command. I let a deliberate pause hang in the air before delivering the counteroffensive. "Tomorrow, 0900 hours, at the offices of Arthur Vance, downtown." The name hit the room like a quiet explosion. Brenda and her lawyers exchanged confused glances. They didn't know the name. That was the point. For a moment, Brenda was stopped short, her arrogant confidence punctured by a needle of uncertainty. But it only lasted a second. Her hubris quickly patched the hole. "Fine," she snapped, snatching her purse from the table. "Delay for another day if you want. It won't change anything." She and her team swept out of the room, leaving a wake of hostile silence and the lingering scent of her perfume. I remained seated, alone in the suffocating quiet. My eyes fell to the stack of papers on the table, the legal ultimatum that was meant to erase me. Then I looked out the window at the streets of Fayetteville, at the flags flying on front porches, at the quiet dignity of a town built on service and sacrifice. Things Brenda would never understand. The battle had officially begun. After leaving the lawyer's office, I didn't drive back to the base. I couldn't. The walls of that small, suffocating room felt like they were still closing in on me. I needed air. I drove aimlessly through the familiar streets of Fayetteville until I found myself pulling over beside the downtown park. Through the windshield, I watched a young family on a picnic blanket. The father was pushing his daughter on a swing, her laughter carrying on the afternoon breeze. The mother was unpacking a basket. They called that family, a safe harbor. But for me, family had always been a battlefield, a place where the deepest wounds weren't inflicted by weapons, but by smiles and whispers across a Thanksgiving dinner table. Brenda's ultimatum wasn't a new declaration of war. It was just the latest battle in a long, grueling campaign. My mind drifted back, pulled by the undertow of memory, to a Thanksgiving a few years ago. The house was filled with the postcard-perfect sense of the holiday. The rich aroma of roasting turkey mingled with the sweet spice of my aunt's famous apple pie. Golden afternoon light streamed through the dining room windows, illuminating the carefully set table and the faces of the extended Carr family, all gathered for their annual performance of togetherness. But beneath the warm glow and the polite chatter, the air was heavy, thick with unspoken tensions and meticulously maintained hierarchies. My aunt, Brenda's mother, was holding court at the head of the table. She was a master of the subtle art of emotional warfare. "Oh, Brenda," she gushed, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "That new interior design project you did for the Hendersons was just divine. You have such an artistic soul, a real passion." Brenda, basking in the praise, described the challenges of picking out throw pillows as if she were detailing a major military campaign. A little while later, a well-meaning cousin from out of town turned to me. "Callie, I heard you were promoted to sergeant. That's incredible. Congratulations." Before I could even say thank you, my aunt waved a dismissive hand, the diamonds on her fingers catching the light. "Oh, all that military business is so complicated," she said, cutting off the conversation. "So drab. Anyway, Brenda, tell everyone about your trip to Paris. We're all dying to hear." And just like that, I was erased. My accomplishment, earned through sweat and discipline and months away from home, was deemed too complicated to be acknowledged. I became invisible, a ghost in uniform sitting at a table laden with food I suddenly had no appetite for. I remember staring at the intricate patterns on my grandmother's china, focusing on the tiny painted flowers to keep the stinging in my eyes at bay. The gift exchange was a masterclass in calculated cruelty. Brenda presented her mother with a lavish cashmere shawl, which my aunt received with theatrical gasps of delight and a tight, cinematic embrace. My gift was more modest, but it came from the heart. I had bought her a digital photo frame and spent hours carefully scanning old family photos, curating a slideshow of memories that I hoped would make her smile. She took the box from me, her smile thin and tight. "Thank you, dear," she said, the word dear sounding like an insult. "I'll find a place for it." Later that evening, after everyone had left, I found the box. It was unopened, shoved under a side table in the living room, hidden behind a stack of old magazines. It hadn't just been set aside, it had been discarded. My gift, my effort, my silent plea to be seen as part of the family, dismissed as worthless. A familiar coldness seeped into my chest, the feeling of a door being gently but firmly shut in my face. But the final, most brutal blow came at the dinner table. As we were passing the mashed potatoes and gravy, Brenda decided it was time for some entertainment at my expense. "I heard the funniest joke the other day," she announced, a malicious glint in her eyes. It was about female soldiers who looked and acted like men. A wave of uncomfortable, polite laughter rippled through the older relatives. Then, she turned her attention directly to me, her voice syrupy sweet. "No offense, sis," she said, using the term like a weapon. "I just find it so strange that any woman would rather roll around in the mud than find a nice, wealthy husband." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel every eye in the room on me. Before I could formulate a response that wouldn't get me court-martialed, my aunt chimed in, her voice dripping with false concern. "She's right, you know. Your grandfather indulges you too much. He should have taught you how to be a lady." In that moment, I felt stripped bare, my choices, my career, my very identity dissected and ridiculed in front of everyone. It was a public shaming disguised as family conversation. I looked across the table, searching for an ally, a friendly face. All I saw were people looking down at their plates, suddenly fascinated by their green bean casserole. All except one. Grandpa. He hadn't said a word, but his actions spoke volumes. He slowly, deliberately, placed his fork and knife down on his plate. The quiet clink of silver on china cut through the tension like a gunshot. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He just looked at his daughter-in-law, then at his granddaughter, and his eyes, usually so full of warmth, were as cold and hard as steel. The laughter died. The conversation stopped. The point was made. That night, I didn't cry. The pain was too deep for tears. I excused myself and went out onto the back porch, the frigid November air a welcome shock to my system. I stood there, wrapped in the cold, staring out at the dark, skeletal trees. A few moments later, the door creaked open. It was Grandpa. He came and stood beside me, not saying anything at first. He simply draped his old, heavy army-issued wool coat over my shoulders. The scent of cedar and old leather enveloped me, a familiar comfort from my childhood. He put a warm, steady hand on my shoulder. "Courage doesn't always roar, Callie," he said, his voice a low rumble beside me. "Sometimes courage is the quiet voice at the end of the day saying, 'I will try again tomorrow.' Don't you ever let them extinguish your fire." His words, his presence, that warm coat. It was everything. It was the confirmation that I wasn't crazy, that the cruelty was real, but that I wasn't alone in it. He saw me. He always saw me. Standing there in the freezing dark, wrapped in the embrace of the only true family I'd ever known, I found the strength to face another day. The scars from that Thanksgiving, and so many days like it, were deep. But in the cold, quiet dark of that night, they began to feel less like wounds and more like armor. The memory of that Thanksgiving faded, leaving the quiet hum of my car's engine in its place. I was still parked by the park, the sun now lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the grass. I looked down at my hands on the steering wheel. They weren't the soft, manicured hands of Brenda. They were a soldier's hands, crisscrossed with small silvery scars and hardened with calluses at the palms and fingertips. Brenda had said Grandpa gave me his name. But these scars, these calluses, I had earned these myself. They were my medals, proof of the first war I ever fought, the one for my own survival. A war that began on a Greyhound bus heading west. The memory shifts, pulling me back to the week after my high school graduation. I was 18. The final straw wasn't dramatic. It was just another casual cutting remark from Brenda about my freeloading status. That night, something inside me finally snapped. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I simply went numb. In the quiet darkness of my room, I packed a worn-out backpack. It didn't hold much, a few changes of clothes, a well-read copy of Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, and the fountain pen Grandpa had given me for graduation. I didn't leave a note. I didn't say goodbye. I just left a void where I used to be. At dawn, I walked to the bus station and bought a one-way ticket west. The destination didn't matter, as long as it was far away from the place that had suffocated my soul for so long. I remember the hiss of the bus's air brakes as it pulled away from the curb, a sound of finality and escape. I fell asleep against the vibrating window, the gnawing hunger in my stomach a dull ache, but for the first time in my life, I felt a strange, exhilarating sense of freedom. The bus dropped me in a small, dusty town in the middle of Nebraska. The sky was huge and empty, the landscape flat and unforgiving. It felt like the edge of the world. It was perfect. I found a tiny room to rent above a hardware store and a job waiting tables at a 24-hour truck stop diner called the Prairie Rose. My life became a blur of 16-hour shifts. I started before sunrise, pouring endless cups of black coffee for weary long-haul truckers and weathered farmers whose hands told stories of hard work and hardship. I wiped ketchup stains from vinyl booths, memorized the difference between meatloaf specials on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and learned to smile even when my feet felt like they were on fire. The diner was a world away from the polished, passive-aggressive cruelty of my aunt's dining room. Here, life was straightforward. You worked hard, you were polite, and people treated you with a baseline of respect. It was exhausting, but it was honest. Every night, I'd climb the creaky stairs to my small room, the smell of grease and burnt coffee clinging to my clothes. Under the dim light of a single bare bulb, I would empty my pockets and count my tips, a pile of crumpled $1 bills and a handful of loose change. It was never much, but as I stacked the coins and smoothed the bills, a quiet pride would swell in my chest. This money was mine. It wasn't an allowance, it wasn't a gift, it was the direct result of my own labor. For the first time, I felt my worth wasn't tied to anyone else's charity or approval. The smell of the diner on my clothes wasn't the smell of poverty. It was the perfume of independence. A few months in, a letter arrived. It was from Grandpa. He tracked me down through an old service buddy who lived in the next county over. My hands trembled as I opened it, half expecting a lecture. But there were no recriminations, no demands to come home. He simply wrote, "I am proud of your courage, but remember, you always have a home to return to." Tucked inside the letter was a check for $500. Tears I hadn't allowed myself to shed for months streamed down my face. I cried for his kindness, for the love I had run away from. But as I stared at the check, I knew I couldn't accept it. To do so would be to admit defeat, to concede that I couldn't make it on my own. With a heavy heart, I tore the check into small pieces. I wrote him back on a single sheet of diner stationery, thanking him for his love and trying to explain that this was something I had to do for myself. It was the hardest decision I'd ever made, but it was the one that cemented the foundation of the person I was becoming. I was reading Viktor Frankl's book at the time, and one line had seared itself into my mind. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. I couldn't change my family, but I could change my own fate. My path forward appeared one sweltering afternoon. A group of young soldiers, their uniforms crisp despite the heat, came into the diner for lunch. They were loud and boisterous, trading jokes and insults with the easy camaraderie of a pack of brothers. They moved with a shared purpose, a sense of belonging that I'd only ever seen in movies. They talked about discipline, about service, about being part of something bigger than themselves. I watched them from behind the counter, a plate of apple pie in my hand. I looked at their confident posture, their shared identity. Then I looked at my own reflection in the chrome coffee machine, a tired girl with dishwater hands and an uncertain future. In that moment, the path became clear. That evening, I walked into the Army recruitment office on Main Street. The air inside was cool and quiet, a world away from the clatter of the diner. A recruiter, a sergeant with a kind face and a sharp uniform, looked up from his desk. He asked me why I wanted to join. I didn't give him a long, complicated story. I just said, "I'm looking for a family where your place is earned, not given." He seemed to understand. The Army wasn't just a job, it was a promise. It was a chance to build a new life on a foundation of merit, not bloodlines. It was a place where my discipline and my resilience wouldn't be seen as strange or unfeminine, but as assets. It was the only road I could see that led to becoming the person my grandfather always believed I could be. It was the start of building my own fortress, one brick of hard-earned self-respect at a time. The Army recruiter had promised me a family where my place was earned. He didn't tell me I'd have to go through hell to find it. Basic training was a crucible of controlled suffering, designed to break you down and rebuild you from scratch. Every muscle in my body screamed, my lungs burned, and my mind was pushed to its absolute limit. But there was a profound difference between this crucible and the slow-burning torment of my aunt's house. Here, the hardship had a purpose. Here, everyone suffered equally. There were no favorites, no bloodlines, just a shared struggle that forged bonds stronger than steel. At home, I was a shadow. Here, among the ranks, I found my footing. I remember one grueling forced march under the relentless South Carolina sun. We were 10 miles in, weighed down by full packs, and my ankle twisted on a loose rock. A sharp, white-hot pain shot up my leg, and I went down hard. For a second, lying there in the dirt, the taste of dust and failure in my mouth, the old voices came back. Brenda's sneering, my aunt's dismissal. Useless, not good enough. The thought of quitting, of just lying there, was a seductive whisper. But then, a hand was on my arm. It was a fellow recruit, a small, wiry girl from the Bronx named Diaz. She was breathing just as hard as I was, sweat stinging her eyes, but her grip was firm. "Get up, Car," she grunted, pulling me to my feet. She slung my arm over her shoulder, taking on part of my weight. "Come on." We finished together. We limped across the finish line, second to last, our uniforms soaked through, our bodies shaking with exhaustion. But we had finished. Together. As I stood there, leaning on Diaz, my tears mixed with the sweat and grime on my face. But these weren't the silent, lonely tears of Thanksgivings past. They were tears of gratitude. For the first time in my life, when I had fallen, someone had turned back for me. That spirit, the unbreakable ethos of "leave no one behind," became the cornerstone of my new life. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a way of being. I saw it in the way soldiers shared the last of their water on a training exercise, the way they'd cover a shift for a buddy whose kid was sick, the way they'd sit in silence with someone who'd just received bad news from home. This new definition of family was never clearer than during my first Thanksgiving deployed overseas. We were stationed at a forward operating base in Germany, a world away from home. A heavy sense of homesickness had settled over the entire platoon. The holidays are always the toughest part of a deployment. Instead of letting us wallow, our platoon sergeant, a big, tough-as-nails African-American man named First Sergeant Jackson, decided we were going to have our own feast. He organized a potluck in the common area. It wasn't fancy. We ate off paper plates and sat on overturned supply crates. But it was real. Jackson, using a makeshift deep fryer, made his mom's famous Southern fried chicken. Diaz, it turned out, could make incredible tamales from ingredients she'd begged from the mess hall cooks. A guy from Texas made a huge pot of five-alarm chili. A quiet soldier from Boston, who barely ever spoke, surprised everyone with a fantastic New England clam chowder. Remembering my days at the Prairie Rose Diner, I managed to bake a perfect pumpkin pie in the mess hall's industrial oven. We sat crowded together in that drafty rec room, the air filled with the delicious, mismatched smells of American home cooking. We shared food, traded stories, and poked fun at each other. There were no cutting remarks disguised as jokes, no gifts given with a sneer. There was only the raw, honest warmth of a family forged in shared hardship. It was the best Thanksgiving I'd ever had. First Sergeant Jackson saw something in me I hadn't yet seen in myself. He was more than a superior, he became a mentor. He saw my discipline and my intelligence, but he also saw the deep sadness I tried so hard to hide behind a soldier's stoic mask. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling field exercise, he called me into his office. "Sergeant Carr," he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "I don't know what you've been through in your life, but I see it in the way you push yourself twice as hard as everyone else, like you're constantly trying to prove you belong here." He leaned forward, his gaze direct and kind. "You don't have to prove anything. Not anymore. You do your job, you do it well, and you've earned your place. We've got your six." His simple words of acceptance, of unconditional validation, cracked the defensive wall I had spent a lifetime building. He saw my effort not as a sign of desperation, but as a mark of my character. He was telling me I was home. My bond with Grandpa deepened too. Through crackling long-distance phone calls and carefully written letters, we didn't waste time on small talk. We discussed strategy, geopolitics, and articles from The Economist that he'd clip and mail to me. Our relationship was a meeting of minds, a shared respect that transcended blood. It was during one of those calls that the old world and the new one collided. Brenda, on a rare visit to see Grandpa, overheard us discussing tactical logistics. A few hours later, my phone rang. It was her. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed, her voice venomous. "Trying to win him over with all that boring war talk? He's an old man, Callie. His mind is going. Don't you dare try to take advantage of him." Her words were meant to hurt, to plant a seed of doubt and guilt. But instead, they had the opposite effect. For the first time, I didn't feel a sting of pain. I felt a surge of clarity. Brenda wasn't just greedy. She was afraid, terrified. She was afraid that a bond built on mutual respect and intellectual connection was infinitely stronger than a flimsy claim based on shared DNA. She knew she was losing the war for our grandfather's legacy, and she had just revealed her own desperate, tactical weakness. The fight wasn't just about money, it was about worth. And for the first time, I knew, without a doubt, that I had it. I had seen Brenda's weakness, that flicker of fear in her eyes during our last phone call. I just hadn't anticipated that she would mobilize the entire family as a weapon to protect it. The psychological warfare began subtly, a few years before Grandpa passed. It started not with a shout, but with a voice dripping honeyed poison. My aunt, Brenda's mother, began calling me at the base. Her tone was always saccharine, full of feigned warmth that never quite reached her eyes. "Callie, darling," she'd begin, her voice smooth as silk. "I know how much you love your grandfather, and he just adores talking to you. But he's getting older now, you know. All this talk about politics and military strategy, it gets him so worked up. It's just not good for his heart." I recognized the tactic instantly. She was playing the part of the concerned, dutiful daughter-in-law, but her objective was clear: to isolate me from my only ally, to cut my supply line. "You should let him rest, dear," she continued, her voice laced with the kind of condescending sweetness that sets your teeth on edge. "Let Brenda and the family handle things here. You just focus on your work." It was a command disguised as a loving suggestion, a velvet glove hiding an iron fist. I would politely thank her for her concern and hang up, the phone feeling cold in my hand. When that didn't work, when Grandpa and I continued our calls, Brenda escalated to phase 2. I began to think of it as the deployment of the flying monkeys. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly filled with an urgent need to offer me unsolicited advice. An uncle from Florida called, then a cousin from Oregon. They all followed the same script, their words clearly fed to them by Brenda. "Callie," my uncle would say, his voice thick with false sincerity. "We're hearing there's some misunderstanding in the family. You know Brenda just loves you to pieces. You're a soldier. You understand sacrifice? Sometimes we have to make sacrifices for the greater good of the family." They painted Brenda's greed as a noble cause, the greater good of the family, and my fight for self-respect as a selfish, disruptive act. It was a coordinated campaign designed to wear me down, to make me question my own reality. I recognized it for what it was, a classic psychological operation. My training in SEER, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, had taught me to identify these tactics when used by an enemy. Isolation, psychological pressure, exploitation of weakness. I never imagined I'd be using that training to analyze my own family. I'd listen patiently, offer a non-committal, "Thank you for your concern, uncle," and end the call. But the most vicious, most desperate attack came when Grandpa's health finally began to decline. It was nothing critical at first, just a precautionary hospital stay for some routine tests. For Brenda, it was a golden opportunity. I was in my barracks room overseas, reviewing after-action reports, when my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from her. There was no text, just a photo. It was a picture of Grandpa, asleep in a hospital bed. The lighting was harsh, making his skin look pale and waxy. He looked frail, tired, and vulnerable. My heart seized in my chest. Before I could even process the image, a second message came through. "He keeps asking for you. The doctor says he needs to avoid all stress. Your stubbornness is killing him." The words hit me like a physical blow. The air rushed out of my lungs. For one terrifying moment, the floor fell out from under me. All the training, all the discipline, all the emotional armor I had so carefully constructed, it all dissolved. What if she was right? What if my fight, my need to be seen, was causing him pain? The guilt was a tidal wave, swift and suffocating, pulling me under. My fingers trembled as I stared at the screen, the image of my grandfather, so small in that big hospital bed, burning into my mind. I was a soldier trained to face enemies, but how could I fight an enemy that used my own love as a weapon against me? My training kicked in on instinct. Verify intelligence before acting. I took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing the panic down. I bypassed the chain of command in my head and went straight to the source. I dialed the main number for the hospital back in North Carolina, my knuckles white as I clutched the phone. I asked to be put through to Colonel Winston Carr's room. After what felt like an eternity, the line clicked. "Hello?" It was his voice, not weak, not frail. It was the same strong, confident baritone I had known my whole life. "Grandpa, it's Callie." "Callie girl, what a surprise!" he boomed, and I could hear the rustle of a newspaper in the background. "To what do I owe the honor?" I got a message from Brenda," I stammered, the relief making my voice shaky. "A photo. She said you were asking for me, that I was causing you stress." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, all the cheerfulness was gone, replaced by a weary sigh that carried the weight of years of disappointment. "That girl," he said, his voice low and hard. "She would use anything as a weapon, Callie, even love itself." He paused again, and I could picture him, sitting up in that hospital bed, his military bearing returning. "Listen to me. This was a routine checkup. The doctors are just being overly cautious, as usual." "I'm fine. Do you understand me? I am fine." "Yes, sir," I whispered. "Brenda is deploying fear and doubt. Those are the tools of a weak opponent. You do not let her turn your goodness, your love for me, into a weakness for her to exploit. You trust the facts, not the fear she's selling. Is that clear, Sergeant?" His words were like a splash of ice water, shocking me back to reality. The guilt receded, replaced by a cold, hard anger. He was right. Brenda hadn't just sent me a photo, she had launched a precision-guided emotional missile, aimed directly at the most vulnerable part of my heart. And it had almost worked. "Yes, Colonel," I said, my voice steady now, the tremor gone. Crystal clear. We talked for a few more minutes about his beloved baseball team and a new book on military history he was reading. When we hung up, I sat in the silence of my room for a long time. The anger wasn't hot and explosive. It was cold and focused. The lines had been drawn. Brenda had proven that there was no depth to which she would not sink. And in doing so, she had just made a grave tactical error. She had shown me exactly how ruthless I would need to be in the battle to come. The cold anger that solidified in me after that phone call became my armor. I thought I was prepared for anything Brenda could throw at me. I was wrong. I was never prepared for what I saw when I came home on leave, a few months before Grandpa passed. That was the day the war went from cold to hot. That was the breaking point. I walked into his study, my favorite room in the house, and stopped dead in the doorway. The room was unrecognizable. It was an invasion, a hostile occupation. Brenda had redecorated. The floor-to-ceiling shelves, once filled with leather-bound books on history and military strategy, were now half empty. The books that remained were crammed carelessly into cardboard boxes in the corner. The tactical maps that had once papered the walls, showing battlefields from Normandy to the Korengal Valley, were gone. In their place hung cheap, abstract art prints and glossy pages torn from fashion magazines. And there, sitting at Grandpa's magnificent oak desk, was Brenda. She was casually painting her toenails, a bottle of bright pink polish balanced precariously on a stack of his journals. The air, which should have smelled of old paper, leather, and pipe tobacco, now reeked of nail polish remover. She looked up, not a hint of shame on her face. "Oh, you're back," she said with a bored sigh. "I thought this place needed a little life. It smelled like a dusty old museum." My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced myself to remain calm, my eyes scanning the room like a soldier assessing a compromised position. That's when I saw it. In the corner on the floor was his shadow box, the sacred display case holding his life's honors, his purple heart, his silver star, his jump wings, and a collection of faded photographs. The glass front had been removed and leaned against the wall. And then I saw the desecration. Brenda had taken the American flag, the one that had been ceremoniously folded and presented to him at his retirement parade, and was using it to wipe up a small dark ring of spilt coffee from the hardwood floor. "Ugh, this old rag comes in handy," she muttered to herself, oblivious. The blood in my veins turned to ice. Every bit of air left my body. That wasn't just a flag. It was a symbol of his entire life of service. It represented every soldier who had served beside him, every friend who had fallen, every sacrifice he had ever made for his country. It was his honor, folded into 13 crisp triangles, and she was using it like a paper towel. Something inside me, a dam of restraint that had been holding back a lifetime of injustice, finally broke. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. My voice when it came out was a low, dangerous whisper I didn't recognize as my own. "Put the flag down." Brenda jumped, startled by my tone. For a second, she looked almost scared. But, as always, her arrogance quickly resurfaced. "God, what's your problem? It's just a piece of cloth." "That is not a piece of cloth," I snarled, the words tearing from my throat. I crossed the room in 2 strides and snatched the flag from her hand, my fingers recoiling from the damp, stained fabric. I held it as if it were a wounded soldier. "This is honor. This is blood. This is everything you will never understand." She stood up, placing her hands on her hips, the picture of indignation. "Oh, here we go. Little Miss Soldier is going to lecture me on patriotism? This is my house, Callie, my family's house. You have no right to give orders here." That was it. That was the final, unforgivable straw. All the years of being ignored, of being belittled, of being treated like a second-class citizen in my own home, coalesced into a single point of cold, diamond-hard clarity. I looked her dead in the eye. "You don't have a family, Brenda," I said, my voice quiet but shaking with the force of my conviction. "You have business arrangements, and as of this moment, my arrangement with you is terminated." I turned and walked out, leaving her standing there, stunned into silence for the first time in her life. That night, After I had carefully refolded the flag and respectfully placed it back in its case, I went to Grandpa. He was sitting on the porch, watching the stars come out. I told him everything. I told him about the study, the books, the flag. I didn't cry, but my voice trembled as I spoke. He listened in complete silence, his jaw tight. When I finished, he didn't offer words of comfort. He just reached out and took my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. His old eyes, still sharp and clear, met mine in the dim twilight. And in them, I saw not sadness, but a firm, unshakable resolve. "It's time, Callie," he said, his voice the calm, steady tone of a commander giving a final briefing. "It's time to execute the final campaign." It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a lament. It was an order. And I, a soldier, accepted my mission. If you believe that there are lines that should never be crossed, especially when it comes to honoring those we love, please hit that like button. And tell me in the comments, just type, "I stand with Callie," to let me know you're here with me on this. In that moment, standing on the porch with my grandfather, every last shred of hope for a peaceful resolution, every lingering fantasy of having a real family with these people, evaporated into the night air. There was no more confusion, no more doubt. There was only the mission ahead. My grandfather was a student of history, a disciple of the great military strategists. He admired Dwight D. Eisenhower, not just for his victories, but for his meticulous planning. "Plans are useless," he loved to quote, "but planning is indispensable." After the incident with the flag, I learned just how indispensable his planning had been. That night on the porch, when he gave me the order to execute the final campaign, he wasn't speaking in metaphors. He was giving me a direct command. The tiredness seemed to fall away from him. The weight of his age was replaced by the familiar, electrifying energy of a commander before a major operation. He led me down to the basement, to a steel door I'd never seen opened. Behind it was a small windowless room he had built years ago. It wasn't a man cave or a workshop. It was a war room. A large whiteboard dominated one wall, covered in complex financial flowcharts and legal structures. On a reinforced table sat a secure satellite phone and a laptop shielded from electronic eavesdropping. This was his private command center. "Welcome to headquarters, Sergeant," he said, his voice crisp and clear. He pointed to a series of numbers written in red marker on the whiteboard. "This is the intelligence report. In the last 6 months, your aunt has called me 12 times. The subject of every call was a request for money. Brenda has called 27 times for the same purpose. You," he said, tapping a final number, "have called 43 times. And every single time it was to ask if I needed anything." He looked at me, his eyes sharp. "The numbers don't lie, Callie. They reveal character." He then unlatched a heavy leather briefcase on the table. Inside were 2 thick folders, each stamped with a single word in bold red ink: "Confidential." He slid the first one across the table to me. It was a complete intelligence dossier on Brenda. It contained her credit card statements, detailing a lifestyle of extravagant waste. Spa days, designer clothes, expensive vacations she couldn't afford. It included printouts of emails to her friends, bragging about the massive inheritance she was about to receive. It even had transcripts of text messages she'd sent, complaining about having to babysit the senile old man. Then he handed me the second folder. It was my file. Inside were the handwritten letters I'd sent him from every duty station, the geopolitical analyses I'd written for him, and, to my surprise, copies of thank you notes from several veterans' charities I had been donating to anonymously for years. "This is our ammunition," Grandpa said, his voice low and serious. "The truth, unvarnished and undeniable." He believed that in any conflict, victory depended on 3 things: superior intelligence, a fortified position, and a decisive strategy. He had just shown me the intelligence. Now, he revealed the fortress. He activated the satellite phone and initiated a secure video call. A moment later, the face of a man in his late 60s appeared on the laptop screen. He had a neatly trimmed silver beard, sharp blue eyes, and wore a perfectly tailored suit. He sat in a wood-paneled office, an entire wall of leather-bound law books behind him. Arthur, my grandfather said warmly. Good to see you. And you, Winston, the man replied, his accent crisp and British. Arthur, I'd like to introduce you to our new commanding officer, Grandpa said, gesturing to me. The man on the screen, Arthur Vance, nodded at me with a look of profound respect. Sergeant Carr, it is an honor. Your grandfather has told me a great deal about you. For the next hour, they briefed me. Arthur Vance was not just any lawyer. He was a top international solicitor based in London and my grandfather's closest friend since their university days at Oxford. For the past 3 years, they had been quietly building an impenetrable legal fortress. While Brenda was busy planning how to spend her inheritance, Grandpa and Arthur were moving the vast majority of it out of her reach. The portfolio was staggering. It wasn't just the house and some stocks. It was a global logistics company based in Singapore, commercial real estate near Ramstein Air Base in Germany, and a multi-million-dollar portfolio of defense technology stocks. One by one, asset by asset, they had legally transferred ownership from my grandfather's name into a series of irrevocable trusts in Switzerland and Singapore. Trusts that named me as the sole controller and beneficiary. The inheritance battle Brenda was planning to fight had already been fought and won 3 years ago, in complete secrecy. After Arthur signed off, Grandpa closed the laptop. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of a commander's steel and a grandfather's love. Now, for the final test, he said. The strategy. I am leaving all of my domestic assets, the house, the U.S. stocks, everything, to Brenda in my will. It's a substantial amount, enough to make her feel like she's won. He paused, letting the words sink in. Her greed will blind her. She will assume that's everything, and she will still come after you for what she perceives as your smaller share. She will attack. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. And when she does, that is when you reveal our fortified position. That is when you spring the trap. But you must do it correctly. No pity, no anger. You will be cold, professional. You will conduct yourself like a soldier, delivering an after-action report. He reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. His skin was thin and wrinkled, but his grip was strong. You won't just be inheriting my assets, Callie, he said, his voice thick with emotion for the first time. You will be inheriting my legacy, a legacy of honor. Protect it. It wasn't a dying man's last wish. It was a transfer of command. It was the ultimate validation, the absolute trust he had placed in me his entire life, now made tangible. I straightened my back and stood up. Yes, sir, I said, my voice clear and steady. Understood, Colonel. The memory faded, and I was back in the present, sitting in my quiet car outside the lawyer's office in Fayetteville. The briefing was over. The planning was complete. Now, it was time to execute. I pulled out my phone, my fingers steady as I found the international number in my contacts. It rang twice before a familiar, precise British voice answered. Vance? Mr. Vance, I said, my voice as cool and professional as I could make it. Sergeant Carr here. I took a final deep breath. Operation Legacy is a go. What hour is 0900 tomorrow? The battlefield had changed. Yesterday, it had been a cramped, low-rent office smelling of desperation. Today, it was the top-floor conference room of Arthur Vance's downtown law firm. The air here smelled of old money, oak polish, and the quiet authority of leather-bound legal texts that lined the walls. It was a room built for power plays, and today, I was no longer on the defensive. At 8:55, Arthur and I were already seated at the massive mahogany table. I wore my dress uniform, the fabric crisp, the brass on my lapels gleaming under the recessed lighting. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded on the table in front of me, my expression neutral. At precisely 0900, the door opened. Brenda swept in, flanked by her 4-man legal team. She was dressed for victory in a bright red power suit, her confidence practically vibrating off her. She looked like she was arriving to accept an award. Her lawyers, smelling blood in the water, arranged themselves around her like a protective phalanx. Brenda shot a triumphant, pitying look at me. Ready to sign, little sister, she purred, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. Arthur Vance, who had been silently observing, didn't even bother with greetings. He simply tapped a pen on the folder in front of him, drawing all attention. "Good morning," he began, his voice as cool and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. "We are here to clarify the final terms regarding the estate of the late Colonel Winston Carr." He let the formal title hang in the air for a moment before proceeding. This was the first volley. He began by giving Brenda exactly what she came for. "As stipulated in the Colonel's last will and testament," Arthur stated, his British accent making every word sound like a final judgment. The entirety of his domestic assets, including real estate, US-based equities, and all personal effects, estimated at a value of approximately $4.2 million after taxes and fees, are bequeathed to his granddaughter, Mrs. Brenda Wallace. A wave of pure, unadulterated triumph washed over Brenda's face. She shot me a look so sharp with mockery and vindication it was almost comical. She even allowed herself a small, victorious smile, leaning back in her chair as if the matter was settled. Her lead lawyer nodded curtly, a predator satisfied with the kill. Arthur didn't pause. He continued in the same flat, procedural tone. "However, for the sake of full transparency, it must be noted that these domestic assets represent approximately 20% of the Colonel's total net worth at the time of their transfer." Silence. The word transfer landed like a grenade in the center of the room. The victorious smirk on Brenda's face froze, then cracked. Her lawyer leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. "I'm sorry, what was that? 20%? What transfer?" The trap was sprung. One of Brenda's other lawyers, a younger, more aggressive man, jumped to his feet. "What international assets? We'll sue. My client is the sole blood heir. We will contest any and all external claims." Arthur Vance merely offered a slight, almost imperceptible shrug. "You are welcome to try. Though you may find it difficult, given that the international assets in question, which include a logistics and shipping corporation in Singapore, commercial real estate adjacent to Ramstein Air Base in Germany, and a considerable portfolio of international defense technology stocks, have not been the legal property of Colonel Carr for the past 3 years." He let that sink in before delivering the second, more devastating blow. They were, in fact, legally and irrevocably transferred into a series of trusts domiciled in Switzerland and Singapore, trusts which are under the sole and exclusive control of Sergeant Callie Carr. With a quiet, deliberate movement, Arthur pushed a stack of documents, nearly 6 inches thick and bound in blue legal covers, across the mahogany table. It slid to a stop directly in front of Brenda's lead counsel. "Every transfer is here, authenticated, notarized by international bodies, and entirely beyond the reach of U.S. probate court." The lead lawyer stared at the documents as if they were a coiled snake. Brenda's face had gone from triumphant to confused to utterly shocked. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin a pasty white that clashed horribly with her red suit. "What? No, that's impossible," she stammered. He couldn't." Her lawyer, desperately trying to regain control, slammed his hand on the table. "This is a clear case of undue influence. Our client will testify that the Colonel was not of sound mind, that he was manipulated." Arthur Vance's expression didn't change, but I saw a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. This was the moment Grandpa had predicted. "I'm glad you brought that up," he said smoothly. He reached into his briefcase and placed a small digital audio recorder on the table. He pressed play. Brenda's own shrill, grating voice filled the silent room. "Come on, Grandpa, it's just money. It's not like you can take it with you on your final deployment, right?" The sound of her callous, mocking words hung in the air like a toxic fog. A deep, horrified flush crept up Brenda's neck. Her lawyers stared at her, their professional masks cracking to reveal open disgust. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the quiet hum of the room's ventilation system. But Arthur wasn't finished. He tapped a button on the conference phone. "Mr. Chen, are you with us?" A large screen on the wall flickered to life, revealing a distinguished, elegantly dressed Asian man in a high-tech office overlooking a bustling harbor. "Yes, Arthur, I'm here. Good evening from Singapore." "Mr. Chen," Arthur said, "could you please greet the chairwoman of your board?" The man's face broke into a warm, respectful smile. He looked directly at me. "Good morning, Ms. Carr," he said. "The Q3 reports are excellent. I'm awaiting your directives for the next round of capital investments." That was the kill shot. The final, undeniable proof. I wasn't just an heir. I was already in command. Brenda made a small choking sound. She looked from the screen to the recorder, to the mountain of legal documents, and finally, to me. In her eyes, I saw the complete and utter collapse of her world. The arrogance, the condescension, the cruelty. It all crumbled away, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell. She had built her entire identity on a foundation of entitlement, and I had just watched it turn to dust. She slumped in her chair, a general surveying the ruins of her own defeated army. The war was over. I walked out of Arthur Vance's office and left the wreckage of Brenda's life behind me. The elevator descended in silence, the quiet hum a stark contrast to the explosive demolition I had just witnessed. I had expected to feel a surge of triumph, a rush of vindication. Instead, as I stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, all I felt was a profound, hollow emptiness. There was no victory parade, no sweet taste of revenge, just the quiet exhaustion of a soldier after a long and brutal campaign. I got in my car and just drove, the radio silent, my mind a blank slate. Victory tasted bitter. I had won. I had protected my grandfather's legacy and honored his final command. But in doing so, I'd also been forced to detonate the last, fragile illusion of what I once called my family. And in that moment, I understood a hard truth. In a war like this, no one really wins. The days that followed were filled with the predictable aftershocks. My phone became a battlefield of its own. First came the barrage from Brenda. The initial texts were a volley of pure, venomous rage. "You're a monster, a snake. You stole everything from me." Then, as the reality of her situation and the size of her legal bills set in, the tone shifted to desperate, pathetic pleading. "Callie, please, we're family. Just call it off. I'm begging you." Finally, after weeks of unanswered messages, came the silence. I never responded. Not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. I knew that any engagement, any reply, would be seen as an opening, an invitation to pull me right back into the toxic vortex I had just escaped. Establishing a boundary meant holding the line, no matter what. Then came the flying monkeys, the same relatives who had called to pressure me before, now mobilized for a new mission. Their calls were no longer filled with false concern, but with outright condemnation. My uncle from Florida, the one who had lectured me on sacrifice, now accused me of being cold-hearted and ungrateful. My cousin from Oregon left a tearful voicemail about how I had torn the family apart. It was painfully clear. Their loyalty had never been to family, only to power and money. Now that the balance of power had shifted, they were simply attacking the new authority. I blocked their numbers, one by one. Meanwhile, Brenda was doing exactly what Grandpa had predicted. Blinded by greed and goaded on by her lawyers, she launched a series of hopeless, wildly expensive legal challenges against the international trusts. It was a war of attrition she was destined to lose. Over the next 6 months, I received quiet updates from Arthur Vance. Brenda burned through the entirety of her $4.2 million inheritance, feeding it into a bonfire of legal fees across 3 different countries. She hadn't just lost the fortune she never knew existed. She had squandered the one Grandpa had deliberately left for her. She lost everything. The house, the cars, the fair-weather friends, and finally, her reputation. That whole time, I drove. On a long weekend, I found myself heading north on I-95 without a real destination in mind. My car just seemed to know where to go. Hours later, I was in Washington, D.C., pulling through the gates of Arlington National Cemetery. I walked through the endless, silent rows of white headstones, the quiet dignity of the place a soothing balm on my frayed soul. I found his grave, a simple stone identical to all the others, marked only by his name, rank, and the dates of his life. I stood before it, not as a victorious commander, but as a tired soldier reporting back. "I did it, Grandpa," I whispered to the quiet air. I protected your legacy. But what now? The only answer was the gentle rustling of leaves in the old oak trees. I stayed there for a long time, thinking about one of his letters I'd reread the night before. A good soldier knows when to fight, he had written. But a great commander knows when to stop fighting and build the peace. The peace? That's what had been missing. The anger had been a necessary fuel, but it couldn't sustain me forever. I needed to find a way to let it go. A few months later, I found my chance. I was leaving the base one afternoon when I saw her waiting for me by the gate. It was Brenda. I almost didn't recognize her. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by worn jeans and a faded t-shirt. She was thinner, and the harsh lines of stress had carved years onto her face. The arrogant fire in her eyes had been extinguished, leaving behind something empty and lost. She didn't approach me with demands or accusations. She just stood there, looking uncertain. For the first time in my life, I saw her not as a monster, but as a broken person. "Why?" she asked, her voice raspy and weak. "Why would he do that to me?" I looked at her, and the last embers of my anger finally died out, replaced by a profound, aching sadness. "He didn't do anything to you, Brenda," I said, my voice gentle. "He just gave you a mirror, and you didn't like the reflection you saw." I could have said more. I could have listed every slight, every cruelty, every moment of pain she had caused me. But what was the point? The war was over. As Grandpa had said, it was time to build the peace. And peace, I was beginning to understand, wasn't about winning an argument. It was about choosing to walk away from the battlefield. That was the last time we ever spoke. I turned and walked back toward my car, leaving her standing there to face the consequences of her own choices. It wasn't forgiveness, not in the way most people think of it. I wasn't absolving her of her actions. It was something different. It was a release. I was finally and completely letting her go. And in doing so, I was freeing myself. A year after my final quiet encounter with Brenda, I found myself back in Arthur Vance's London office. The legal dust had long since settled. He greeted me with a warm smile and handed me a thick, cream-colored envelope, its wax seal bearing my grandfather's crest. "Winston instructed me to give this to you only when all legal hostilities had ceased," Arthur explained. My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal. Inside was a letter, written in my grandfather's familiar, strong handwriting. It wasn't about assets or trusts. It was about his final strategy, his true endgame. "My dearest Callie," it began. "If you are reading this, it means you have successfully completed your mission. But I must confess, the mission was never about defeating Brenda. My goal was not to destroy her, but to break her. Sometimes a thing must be broken down to its foundations before it can be rebuilt the right way." He went on to explain. He had foreseen her self-destruction, and he had planned for it. He had established one last, small, separate trust. A $50,000 lifeline, as he called it. It was for Brenda. But it came with a non-negotiable condition. The trust could only be activated after she had proven a fundamental change in character. By volunteering for 1 full year at a recognized veteran support organization. Reading his words, I finally understood the breathtaking scope of his wisdom. His legacy wasn't just about preserving wealth or rewarding loyalty. It was about offering a path to redemption, even for those who seemed furthest gone. He wasn't just a strategist. He was a builder of character. And his final lesson was one of profound grace. That letter became my new set of orders. I honorably discharged from the Army, my service complete. The massive fortune he had left me was not a retirement fund. It was a strategic asset, and I now had a new mission: to deploy it. I didn't want his legacy to be a name on a building or a plaque on a wall. I wanted it to be a living, breathing force for good. I took the first step by signing the incorporation documents. My signature, clear and firm, brought into existence the Colonel Carr's Command Legacy Foundation. My new life looked nothing like Brenda's old one. I didn't buy a mansion or a sports car. I traded my uniform for simple jeans and a polo shirt. My headquarters wasn't a sleek corporate office, but a small rented space above a coffee shop in Fayetteville. From there, I didn't command troops. I commanded resources. The Foundation's mission was simple: to serve the community that had given me a home and a purpose. We funded scholarships for the children of deployed soldiers. We provided seed capital for veteran-owned startups. We sponsored service dog training programs for those recovering from PTSD. I didn't just write checks from a distance. I was on the ground, visiting VA centers, sitting in community halls, and listening to the stories of my fellow veterans. I turned my inheritance into a strategic support unit, providing aid and reinforcements to the men and women who, like me, had sworn an oath to serve. About a year later, I received a hesitant email. It was from Brenda. She had done it. After hitting rock bottom, she had found a volunteer position at a soup kitchen for homeless veterans in a city hundreds of miles away. She wrote that she had started it only to get the money. But somewhere along the way, listening to the stories of men and women who had lost everything but their dignity, something inside her had shifted. She wasn't writing to ask for anything. She was writing to say thank you, and that she was sorry. She was finally beginning to understand the lesson Grandpa had tried to teach her, the lesson of service. Following his instructions, I authorized Arthur to activate the trust. I gave my sister a chance to rebuild. The story ends not in a courtroom or a battlefield, but a few years later, in a high school auditorium filled with proud families. It's the first ever awards ceremony for the Command Legacy Foundation. I'm standing at a podium, looking out at the faces of the bright, hopeful young people who are the first recipients of our scholarships. In the front row, I see some familiar faces. First, Sergeant Jackson, now retired, gives me a proud, booming nod. Beside him is Diaz, now a captain, her smile as bright as ever. They are my family, the ones who turned back for me when I fell. And in the back of the room, quietly arranging chairs and handing out programs, is Brenda. She is no longer the brittle, angry woman I once knew. There is a quiet competence about her, a peace in her eyes I've never seen before. Our relationship will never be what it once wasn't, but a new, fragile respect has grown in the space between us, an understanding. I tap the microphone and begin my speech, ending it with the words my grandfather had left for me, the true inheritance. My grandfather taught me that family is not defined by blood, I say, my voice clear and strong, resonating through the hopeful silence of the room. It is defined by loyalty, it is built on respect, and it is proven, always, by service. As I look out at the crowd, at the young scholarship winners, at my brothers and sisters in arms, at the woman in the back who was finally learning what it meant to serve, I know that the Colonel's final campaign was a complete success. His legacy wasn't just protected, it was alive, it was growing, and a new, self-made sunrise was just beginning. If you believe in the power of turning pain into purpose, and if you want to hear more stories of strength, resilience, and justice, please subscribe to this channel. Press the like button if my story resonated with you, and I would be honored if you would share one simple thing in the comments below. The one word you hope defines your legacy. Thank you for being here. Be well.